Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about the collective unconscious or dream interpretation. It was about women who possessed what he called differentiated spiritual intelligence, and why this rare psychological type either destroys them or transforms them into something humanity desperately needs but rarely recognizes. These aren't ordinary sensitive women or spiritual seekers. They're something far more extraordinary and unsettling. Women whose psychological abilities have evolved beyond normal human consciousness. They read energetic signatures like others read books. They decode the hidden symbolic language that governs existence itself. Most controversially, they move between material and spiritual worlds with an accuracy that defies explanation. But here's what Jung found most disturbing. These women are systematically vanishing from society, not through death or migration, but through conscious withdrawal. They're disappearing from workplaces, relationships, social circles, and public life entirely, quietly, deliberately, permanently. If you've been feeling the pull to withdraw, to disappear, to leave it all behind, Jung would say you're not broken. You're becoming too spiritually conscious for the collective container. Here's what Jung understood about why this disappearance is not just inevitable, but essential. Jung's understanding of this essential withdrawal began with his clinical observations. His records from 1907 through the 1950s reveal a disturbing pattern. The most spiritually intelligent women weren't just struggling with society, they were systematically leaving it. One case haunted Jung for decades, a patient he described as the woman who stopped attending church. She came to him in 1909, not for mental illness, but for what she called spiritual suffocation. She had been the most devoted member of her congregation, led prayer circles, organized charity work. Everyone considered her deeply spiritual. Then something shifted. Jung wrote in his private notes, "She began seeing through the spiritual performances around her, the hollow prayers, the unconscious rituals, the spiritual bypassing disguised as devotion. First, she stopped attending church. Her family was concerned but supportive. Then she left her marriage to a man who demanded she perform spiritual submission. Her community was scandalized. Finally, she withdrew from all social circles, not from anger or breakdown, from clarity. She told Jung, 'I cannot pretend to be spiritually asleep while spiritually awake. Every spiritual gathering feels like watching people sleepwalk through sacred rituals. I see their unconscious spiritual hunger while they perform spiritual satisfaction.' This wasn't an isolated case. Jung documented dozens of similar patterns, spiritually intelligent women systematically withdrawing from religious institutions, spiritual communities, even families that demanded spiritual performance over spiritual authenticity. Jung realized he wasn't treating a disorder. He was observing what happens when individual spiritual consciousness evolves beyond collective spiritual unconsciousness. These women weren't failing at spirituality. They were succeeding at it so completely that participating in collective spiritual unconsciousness became impossible. Jung called this the Great Spiritual Withdrawal. He predicted it would become epidemic as more women developed what he termed differentiated spiritual intelligence. The withdrawal wasn't escape, it was preservation. They were protecting their spiritual consciousness from environments that would fragment it. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about why this withdrawal was becoming necessary. The very spiritual gifts that made these women so conscious also made them targets for something he called spiritual shadow projection. Jung discovered that spiritual shadow projection was just the surface. The deeper issue was what he called the Animus rebellion. This is when a woman's integrated spiritual authority becomes incompatible with society's expectations. Here's what Jung observed. Society projects specific roles onto women and men. Women are expected to carry eros, relationship, feeling, emotional support. Men are assigned logos, mind, spirit, rational authority. But spiritually intelligent women do something revolutionary. They integrate their animus. This is their inner masculine principle, their connection to spiritual wisdom and inner authority. Jung documented 4 stages of animus development. The final stage is the most dangerous to collective unconsciousness. The woman develops her own spiritual guidance system, her own connection to divine wisdom, her own inner authority. This creates an impossible conflict. Society demands she remain the carrier of others' emotional and spiritual needs, but her integrated animus demands she follow her own spiritual truth, even when that truth contradicts collective expectations. Jung's patient described the agony. I sit in spiritual gatherings and everyone expects me to be the nurturing, supportive presence. But my inner guidance tells me to speak uncomfortable truths, to challenge spiritual bypassing, to refuse to enable unconscious behavior. When I follow my inner spiritual authority, I'm called difficult, judgmental, or unloving. When I suppress it to keep peace, I feel like I'm betraying my soul. This is the animus rebellion. The integrated woman can no longer perform the spiritual role society assigns her. She has developed her own logos, her own spiritual authority. Jung realized this creates systematic withdrawal. The woman must choose between her authentic spiritual development and social acceptance. She cannot have both. Her integrated animus becomes her guide away from collective spiritual unconsciousness. It demands she withdraw from any system that requires her to abandon her inner spiritual guidance. This withdrawal isn't antisocial, it's pro-authentic. Her spiritual development has made participating in spiritual unconsciousness psychologically impossible. But Jung discovered the withdrawal becomes even more necessary when you understand the energetic cost of maintaining spiritual consciousness in unconscious environments. The energetic cost Jung discovered was staggering. Spiritually intelligent women weren't just psychologically incompatible with unconscious environments, they were being energetically drained to the point of physical breakdown. Jung identified what he called participation mystique. This is when someone cannot distinguish between their own feelings and the feelings of others. For spiritually sensitive women, this becomes a chronic state of energetic absorption. You walk into a room and immediately feel everyone's unprocessed emotions, their spiritual hunger, their unconscious pain, their suppressed shadows. You absorb it all as if it were your own. Jung documented one patient, a teacher, who developed severe chronic fatigue. Medical tests showed nothing wrong. Through analysis, Jung realized she was expending massive energy maintaining her spiritual consciousness while surrounded by unconscious colleagues and students all day. She described her experience. I feel like I'm constantly translating between 2 different languages. My spiritual awareness and their spiritual unconsciousness. Every interaction requires me to not react to their projections, not absorb their unconscious material, not get pulled into their spiritual dramas. By the end of each day, I'm completely depleted. Not from the work itself, but from the invisible labor of maintaining my consciousness against the constant pressure of collective unconsciousness. This is what Jung called energetic fasting. The spiritually conscious woman must withdraw to stop absorbing the psychic noise of the collective. She needs silence to hear her own inner voice again. Her nervous system is kept in perpetual activation by the spiritual unconsciousness around her. Withdrawal becomes the only way to regulate her system and restore energetic sovereignty. Jung realized this wasn't weakness. It was biological necessity. The woman's spiritual sensitivity had evolved beyond what unconscious environments could support. When she left teaching and moved to a cabin in nature, her energy returned within weeks, not from rest, but from no longer having to maintain consciousness against unconscious pressure. Her withdrawal wasn't escape, it was energetic preservation. But Jung discovered that this need for withdrawal went even deeper than individual sensitivity. It connected to something ancestral and collective. Jung discovered that this ancestral connection ran deeper than individual psychology. It was collective trauma embedded in the feminine unconscious. He called it the echo of the pyre. Between 1500 and 1700, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft. 85% were women. But these weren't random victims. They were healers, midwives, herbalists, women who possessed independent spiritual knowledge. Jung realized the witch hunts were systematic attacks on the feminine animus. They targeted women who had developed their own spiritual authority outside patriarchal control. This created what Jung termed the witch wound, a collective scar in the feminine psyche that whispers, "To be spiritually powerful is to invite destruction." You feel this wound when you hesitate to share your spiritual insights, when you dim your intuitive gifts to avoid standing out, when you fear being seen as too much or too intense. Jung's patients described the terror. "I know things others don't know. I see patterns others miss. But every time I speak my truth, I feel like I'm painting a target on my back. There's this ancient fear that if I fully embody my spiritual gifts, something terrible will happen. I'll be rejected, attacked, or destroyed." Jung understood this wasn't paranoia, it was inherited memory. The feminine psyche carries the trauma of centuries of persecution for spiritual independence. The modern withdrawal is healing this ancestral wound. These women are creating safe space to reclaim the spiritual authority their lineage was martyred for possessing. Their retreat isn't cowardice, it's courage. They're doing the work their ancestors couldn't complete, integrating spiritual power without the threat of persecution. Jung observed that this withdrawal serves a dual purpose. It heals personal spiritual development and collective feminine trauma simultaneously. But the withdrawal isn't just about healing old wounds. Jung discovered these women were using their solitude for something even more profound. They were consciously transforming pain into spiritual medicine through what he called the alchemical process. Jung discovered that this spiritual medicine-making required a specific process. He called it spiritual alchemy, the conscious transformation of pain into wisdom, trauma into power, wounds into healing gifts. But spiritual alchemy requires something crucial: a sealed container, a protected space where intense transformation can occur without interference. The spiritually intelligent woman's withdrawal creates this alchemical vessel. Her solitude becomes the sacred laboratory where the great work happens. Jung mapped this process to the classical stages of alchemy. First comes calcination, the fire that burns away false identities. This is often triggered by spiritual crisis, burnout, or what mystics call the dark night of the soul. You feel everything you thought you were dissolving: your old spiritual identity, your people-pleasing patterns, your need for external validation. The fire of truth burns it all away. Then comes dissolution, the emotional flood. In the safety of withdrawal, years of suppressed grief, anger, and trauma surface. You're not having a breakdown, you're having a breakthrough. Next is separation, the sword of discernment. You begin distinguishing your authentic spiritual path from your conditioning, your soul's wisdom from your ego's noise, your personal pain from the collective wounds you've been carrying. Finally, conjunction, the sacred marriage. The purified elements of your psyche reunite in higher synthesis, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, spirit and body. You emerge more whole than you've ever been. Jung understood this work couldn't happen in normal society. The collective unconscious would constantly interrupt the process, pull you back into old patterns, demand you return to your previous spiritual role. Withdrawal protects the transformation. It ensures the alchemical process can complete without interference. One patient told Jung, "I'm not hiding from the world. I'm gestating something the world needs." but it can only be born in silence, away from everyone's opinions and expectations. Jung realized these women weren't just healing themselves. They were processing collective spiritual material, transforming ancestral trauma, converting the lead of the past into the gold of the future. But what happens when this alchemical work is complete? Jung discovered these women don't simply return to society. They return as something entirely different. When these alchemically transformed women return, they don't reintegrate into the old systems. They can't. The process has fundamentally changed them. Instead, they become architects of something entirely new. Jung called this the return of Sophia, divine feminine wisdom emerging in earthly form. These women don't seek to rule over the old patriarchal structures. They make them obsolete by creating better alternatives. You see this happening everywhere, though it's often invisible to mainstream awareness. Small spiritual collectives, women's circles that operate like modern mystery schools, online communities where authentic spiritual development is valued over spiritual performance. These aren't hierarchical organizations. They're decentralized networks of wisdom. Leadership is distributed. Authority comes from lived experience, not assigned titles. The focus is mutual support and collective empowerment. Jung observed that these women lead through what he called energetic integrity. Their power doesn't come from position, but from presence, the quality of their consciousness, the coherence of their spiritual field. They've learned to influence through embodiment rather than argument, to heal through witnessing rather than fixing, to guide through modeling rather than teaching. One of Jung's patients described her return. "I don't try to convince anyone of anything anymore. I just live my truth so authentically that it gives others permission to explore theirs. I've stopped fighting the old world and started building the new one, not through protest or politics, but through creating spaces where consciousness can flourish." This is the subtle matriarchy Jung predicted, not women ruling over men, but wisdom-based influence replacing power-based control, collaboration replacing competition, embodied truth replacing performed spirituality. These women understand something profound. You change the world by first changing consciousness. You transform culture by modeling new possibilities. You heal the collective by becoming whole yourself. Their withdrawal wasn't abandonment, it was preparation. They disappeared to develop what humanity desperately needs but doesn't yet recognize. They return not to the old spiritual communities that rejected them, but as creators of new spiritual containers, spaces that honor rather than exploit spiritual intelligence. Jung's final insight reveals why this entire process, the withdrawal, the transformation, the return, represents humanity's greatest hope for spiritual evolution. Jung's final insight was profound. The great spiritual withdrawal isn't a crisis of feminine spirituality. It's the birth of it. These women aren't disappearing because they've failed at spiritual development. They're disappearing because they've succeeded so completely that the old containers can no longer hold them. Remember Jung's patient from 1909? The woman who stopped attending church? After 4 years of conscious withdrawal and alchemical transformation, she didn't return to her old spiritual community. She became a spiritual guide for other women undergoing the same process. She created what Jung called a sanctuary for the awakening, a space where spiritual intelligence was honored rather than exploited, where withdrawal was understood as wisdom rather than weakness. Jung wrote about her transformation. She learned that her greatest spiritual gift wasn't her ability to see the invisible. It was her courage to honor what she saw, even when it meant standing alone. This is Jung's most dangerous discovery about women with differentiated spiritual intelligence. They're not too sensitive for this world. They're exactly what spiritual evolution requires. Your withdrawal isn't spiritual failure, It's spiritual necessity. You're not abandoning the collective, you're preparing something for it. In your solitude, you're developing what collective consciousness isn't ready for yet. In your disappearance, you're creating spaces for others to disappear to. In your silence, you're gestating wisdom the world desperately needs. The women who are quietly disappearing aren't the problem, they're the solution. They're following an ancient archetypal pattern that has always preceded profound spiritual transformation. Withdraw, transform, return with gifts. You were born to see the invisible, not to suffer in spiritual silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your spiritual intelligence, but it needs it delivered with the integration, wisdom, and sovereignty that can only be forged in conscious solitude. Your disappearance isn't the end of your spiritual journey. It's the beginning of your spiritual mastery